Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to a banner review on the 4.7 banners. This video is coming out a bit late, I'm sorry about that. The banner has Clorinde and Alhaitham as the 5 stars, with Sethos, Thoma, and Bennett as the 4 stars. And we have, obviously, the signatures for Clorinde and Alhaitham. You have Absolution and Light of Foliar Incision. And you have a very blue 4-star lineup, with Lithic Spear being the only one that stands out as not blue. And then you have Stringless, Widsith, Sacrificial Sword, and Sacrificial Greatsword. As usual, we can start with the 5 stars. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into analysis on Clorinde, because I have done that already in the Clorinde pre-release and the Clorinde's first impression videos. So if you're specifically wondering about her, you can go check those out. As a quick little summary for those of you that didn't watch those videos and don't feel like clicking away, she is a very reasonable character. She is not quite game-breaking, but she is strong enough to hold her own against other Electro characters. Damage-wise, she's not really standing out too much, but her self-healing gives her a little bit more team flexibility, and that team flexibility translates to team DPS because you're able to run more offensive units rather than defensive units, and being able to run those more offensive units gives you more team DPS. Overall, she's not anything crazy, but she's also far from bad. The sort of unit that's, like, in my opinion, in like the perfect balance spot where they're more than strong enough that if you like really like them, you want to go for them, you get them. You'll have good teams to play them in where they'll feel strong, but that are not so strong that if you don't like them, you feel like you have to get them. Looking at her constellations, C1 gives you 2 coordinated attacks up to once every 1.2 seconds during her uptime. This is generally going to translate to, like, depending on the situation, anywhere between 4 and maybe 7. I think realistically, you're probably assuming 4 to 6 most of the time. Procs of this, and each proc is 2 hits of 30% of her attack that get affected by her Ascension passive, so it's 2 hits of 90% of her attack. It's a pretty good constellation one. Like, just damage-wise, it's similar to the other strong C1s we have in the game, but obviously it doesn't have any defensive utility like you have on C1 Navidad or C1 Arlecchino. But just damage-wise, it's similar to those constellations in terms of how much it increases your DPS. And then C2 and C3 both like increase her damage. Like, C2 is a pretty okay C2. It's a lot of words, but it just gives her more damage. C3 is more talent levels, which is also, again, more damage, but it's not the best because there's a good portion of her damage that it's not affecting, right? It's not affecting your Ascension damage. It's not affecting your C1 damage. It's not affecting your C2 damage. Like, even though all of her damage is coming from the stuff you get from her normal attacks and skill, a good portion of that damage is not directly affected by skill talent level, which makes it so that this is not as valuable as like normal attack talents would be on a character like Navidad, for example, or Arlecchino. C4 just gives your ult more damage, makes it a nuke. C5 burst damage, and then C6 is, you know, the average, bunch of CV, bunch of front-loaded damage, and it gives you damage resistance. For people that are looking to vertically invest, depending on what weapon you already have, maybe it's better to go for the weapon or her constellation. But her weapon is about a 30-ish, obviously it's going to depend on the team, but about a 30-ish% DPS increase for her compared to the free-to-play options. In Quicken teams, it's going to be less than that in non-Quicken teams, and it's obviously also less than that if you have one of her better sword options, right? If you have a black sword, if you have already any of the 5-star stat stick weapons, it's going to be better, so the increase will be lower, so maybe it's not as valuable for you to go for the weapon. Which means at a baseline, right, C1 and weapon do about the same in terms of damage, which means in most situations, C1 is either equal to or better than weapon, and you don't have to deal with weapon banner RNG. I think once it starts once you start looking at C2 versus weapon, then I mean, C1 R1 is going to be stronger than C2 R0 if you're looking at like free-to-play options, but it's going to be very similar if you're looking at another 5-star stat stick. So again, right, like there's a lot of little stuff going, but as a general rule, I would value constellations before or over signature for the most part if you want to go vertical investment on her. Anyways, I don't want to spend too much time on Clorinde because we've got a lot more. We've got a lot more to cover. Let's talk about Alhaitham. He is good, all things considered, but he's also one of the characters that are good that I think is the least valuable to go for, because he's generally not necessary in his strong teams, in the sense that strong cores with Alhaitham could often replace him for another unit and still be basically just as strong, or at the very least very close. Now, does that mean that he's bad? No, not at all. But he's definitely one of those characters that is, like, with limited budget, limited amount of Primogems, not a priority in my opinion. That being said, despite not being a priority, he is still a pretty strong character, definitely significantly above average when it comes to 5-star character performance. And like, I want to make it very clear, right? I'm talking about him like not necessarily being all that insane in the context of many people consider him to be an insanely strong character that eclipses other options. And that's not something I agree with, and I want to make that clear. But that doesn't mean I think he's a weak character. In any case, right, he's got a lot of upside. His teams are generally pretty easy to play. His play pattern is pretty straightforward, even though there's some, like, dank stuff you can do. You don't really need to do it to get performance out of him. He's a unit that is very good at getting people their first clears. He has synergy with non-Bennett teams, which lets you have Bennett on the other side. He's also not too reliant on Kazuha. Although it is worth noting that while that's partly an upside, not having synergy with animal units in general is a blessing and a curse. It means that it's easier to free them up for the other side, but it also means that it's a lot harder to justify putting an animal unit in your team if you need grouping. But it's not the end of the world, really. Alhaitham's constellations are very much some of the worst in the game when it comes to 5-star characters. Is C1 gives them some cooldown reduction, which is, in practice, not really useful if you're doing proper rotation, but which can make your casual experience better for like overworld stuff or something. I don't know. Is C2, the more EM, cool, I guess. C3, talent levels, cool, I guess. But again, right, he's a quicken carry, so decent amount of of his damage is not talent level reliant. And he's not a carry that has like all of his damage from one talent. Even though his normal attacks don't scale with EM, they do end up being used a lot, which means that you do get some amount of damage coming from that. That's not increased by the C3. C4 is what, 30% dendro damage, which is honestly pretty bad for a C4. Like, if you look at just a DPS calc, a lot of the I mean, if we talk about Clorinde C4 for example, looking at like an overall full rotation, the C4 isn't actually that big of an increase. But in practice, enemies often, especially if you're, you know, on C4 plus characters, often don't survive the first rotation, and having a lot of that damage happen earlier into your rotation makes them die faster in practice at a rate that is not directly proportional to the DPS increase you're getting. But yeah, whereas something like this, even if it, when you look at a cal, isn't like that much worse, in practice just doesn't do nearly as much as a front load constellation does. And C5 is just a joke, and C6 is alright. The reality with a C6 though is that even just like the C6 itself is worse than other C6s, and all the cons before it are also worse than average for a 5-star character, which makes it so that his C6 is just not that good, right? You're not building onto as much that you got ahead of time. So yeah, he definitely has some of the worst constellations in the game. If you're torn between signature and constellation, I think it's definitely better off going signature. That is basically it for Alhaitham. He's a character that is fairly strong, fairly easy to use, and that can fit on a decent amount of accounts because he is a character that's not reliant on Bennett and Kazuha, which, you know, if you're, I don't know, an Arlecchino player, you might want to have Bennett and Kazuha available for your other team. He's going to fit well in your roster on some accounts, but he is far from a necessary unit, so if you know, you're not a huge fan of his playstyle, or you already feel like you have two strong teams and you don't really need to improve them, he's not a character that, like, you really need to be worried about. Let's talk about some of these 4-star characters. We can start with Bennett. Bennett is, and I'm sure this is coming as a surprise to no one whatsoever, one of the best units in the game, and even though I don't consider him to be the best unit in the game, which is a discussion for another day. I definitely consider him to be up there as one of the best units in the game, and I think it's very reasonable to consider him the best unit in the game, depending on what sort of stuff you care about in a unit. Bennett is f***ing broken because he gives you a massive attack buff while also fulfilling the role of a healer on your team. But it's not really the role consolidation that makes him good. Like, obviously it helps, but it's just the size of the buff. The fact that the attack buff is so massive makes it so that even without role consolidation, he'd still be a good unit. And the role consolidation just pushes him over the top. Bennett is not a unit that is that constellation reliant. I think there's a lot of misconceptions going around about how reliant he is on his C1. Like, yeah, the 20% more attack scaling on his ult is good. Don't get me wrong. It is nice. But the HP restriction on the ult is actually not that big of a deal. The ult says if your HP is below 70%, you heal. And if it's above 70%, you gain an attack bonus. Which means that at a baseline, at C0, if you're below 70%, you don't get the attack bonus. The thing is, his healing is so good that you'll heal back to above 70% very quickly. And if you got hit, you likely also got staggered. And if you got staggered, you're not currently in the process of attacking. Which means in most situations, you kind of just get the attack buff back before you even deal damage again. Which makes it so that the C1, like the removal of the HP restriction, is not nearly as important as I think a lot of people believe. It's still nice, right? Especially for Alhaitham, for example, who's a character who can't heal without having to use her ult and lose her uptime, basically. So that at least is nice for Alhaitham, but outside of that, I really think the C1 is not as good as people think. That being said, again, right, the 20% more attack on the scaling of it is still pretty good. I'd still say that it's like kind of his best constellation because it gives you more attack scaling than the ult levels do. C2, when Bennett's HP falls below 70%, his energy recharge is increased by 30%. That's not happening. Bennett is either played as a carry, where he stays on field, and he's going to heal himself enough that he's not going to stay below 70% HP, or he's played as a support, in which case he's off field, so he's not getting hit, so he's not going to be below 70% HP. In other words, this just doesn't really proc. It can proc in Farina teams, but it's fine in Farina teams, it's not that good. C3 gives you skill damage, which is very good for carry Bennett, but pretty worthless for support Bennett. C4 gives you a third hit on your hold E, right? So your hold E at a baseline, you can do hold 1 or hold 2. Hold 1 is a 2-hit combo like this. Hold 2 is a 3-hit combo that launches you back if you're doing it outside of your ult. C4 makes it so that your hold 1, the one that's basically that starts with 2-hit, can get another hit. Like this. It's not that useful for carry Bennett. There's some situations where it's still like usable, but most of the time this is something that can be used for certain setups to get power applications in the right ways, but that generally just doesn't do anything. C5 gets you 18% more attack scaling on your ult, which is alright. And C6 is, I guess, the main point of discussion when it comes to Bennett, because people already know that he's good, and there's really not that much to say about his other constellations, but there's a lot to say about his C6. So, his C6 gives your melee characters a pyro infusion, and all your characters a pyro damage bonus. It doesn't say that it gives all your characters, it says that it's only the melee ones, but it does give all your characters a pyro damage bonus. I guess it's a bug, but it's a bug that's been in the game for so long that I honestly don't think they're going to change it at this point. Bennett's C6 is interesting because it boils down to the fact that if Hoyo decides to be nice, it's pure upside, but Hoyo can decide to be f***ing cringe about it. Most melee characters that do a specific damage type nowadays get a line in their infusion that says this infusion cannot be overridden by other elements. Like you look at Alhaitham has it, but then you have characters like Ayaka that are a bit older that don't have that, and where this C6 is kind of just like, oh, well that sucks. The thing is, and a lot of people don't actually know this because it's whale stuff, but Chiori also doesn't have that. Now that doesn't matter for C0 Chiori because you're never actually using the Geo Infusion because it's awful, but at C6 you are using the Geo Infusion, which means that for C6 Chiori players, Bennett's C6 is actually going to decrease their damage. And because Bennett is in Chiori's best team at C6, it actively means that if you are a C6 Chiori player who C6 their Bennett, you're gonna hate your life. You're not gonna be able to play with Bennett. Or you're gonna play with Bennett and just accept that your C6 is losing you damage. But the reality of it is you are inherently at the mercy of Hoyo. They can make characters where this doesn't ruin things in any way, but they can also make characters where it does. I also think it's worth considering that if they do make characters where this ruins it, it becomes a lot easier to sell you, other attack buffers because, well, this attack buffer sure as doesn't work with your unit. Which means that they actually have a financial incentive to make characters that don't work with Bennett C6 because it lets them sell you other attack buffers more easily. And so I would just hold that in the back of my mind. The other side of it is that for teams that actually benefit from this is a nice constellation. This is actually a pretty good constellation in like Arlecchino teams, in Hu Tao teams. It single-handedly enables some cool stuff, right? You can do the Razor Thundering Furry teams with this, which is pretty pog. It enables, paired with Xianyun and Farina, basically any melee character to actually be a pretty decent carry, just as a pyro plunger that vapes. Alright, even Kave can be a pretty good carry with that. With Lynette's C6, you can self-swirl your weapon, which can give you access to interesting swirl setups, and maybe more importantly, which can let you trigger your swirls and therefore your VV on enemies where you can't apply pyro to them. So like Hydrotopa, for example, is an enemy where you can't apply pyro to it. It's always going to be innately Hydro. So if you want to get VV on it, you need to find some way to get a swirl on something that is not the Topa itself. You can do swirl on yourself with Bennett plus Jean. You can do swirl on an entity that's on the ground with Sucrose plus Xiangling with the Guoba swirl, or Farazan plus Xiangling. Or you can do swirl on your weapon with Bennett C6 plus Lynette C6, or Kazuo has C6 if you have that. That's basically all there is to say about it. Personally, I've activated it, and I generally don't regret it. The one team where I kind of wish I didn't have it is when I play TF Bennett. It makes TF Bennett a huge pain in the ass, because TF Bennett kind of relies on only ever getting your TF procs from your E, and when you get a TF proc from a normal attack, it's not good. But outside of that, most of the time, it doesn't really bother me. But I don't play Ayaka. I certainly don't play Chiori C6. So at the end of the day, do it at your own risk. Next up, Thoma. Thoma is a character that I think gets a bad reputation. I think a lot of people are under the impression that Thoma is only quote-unquote meta in Burgeon teams. And I say meta relatively loosely here, but still, right? Like, people, I think, often think that Thoma is only really quote-unquote meta in those teams. And that's not the case. Thoma's shield is actually pretty strong, and the way that he obtains his shield is also very, very useful. Right, so this is something that I talk about pretty much whenever I talk about Thoma, but interruption resistance in this game is a little weird sometimes. When you're affected by a shield, you cannot be staggered or knocked back. If there's a multi-hit attack that breaks your shield on the first hit, you can get staggered, but outside of that, no. What that means is if you have a shield, no matter how big it is, you will not get staggered.
Don't get too close.
Right? Even though my shield broke and I took damage, I didn't get staggered, I didn't get interrupted, I didn't get anything. The thing is, that works no matter how big or small your shield is. Which means that Thoma's ability to get a mini shield every time he procs his ult, even if it's 1.8% of his max HP plus 200, which like on a full shield build Thoma is gonna be like 500 HP. There's nothing that hits for like less than that. Like, it's basically gonna get broken by any attack if you only have one stack of it. But that doesn't matter for your resistance to interruption, right? And so as long as your ult is active and you're still weaving in normal attacks, you're effectively immune to interruption from most enemies. And that will stay even if the enemies are doing enough damage to break your shield. And that's noteworthy because that's something that most other shielders don't have. When you look at Zhongli, his shield is bigger, but when you're against very aggressive enemies that can actually break the shield, once the shield is gone, so is the resistance to interruption. Which makes it so that characters that care a lot about the resistance to interruption, like Wanderer for example, actually appreciate the fact that Thoma's shield still gives you some resistance to interruption even when it gets quote-unquote broken. That property aside, the shield is still relatively strong, and he's got some other synergies with characters like Wanderer through constellations. So let's look at those. C1 doesn't do anything. You can pretend like it doesn't exist. C2 gives you more duration on your ult, more duration on refreshing your resistance to interruption, which is Pog, and it also means that you get more shielding in total because your ult lasts longer, so you get more procs of it. C3 increases kill talent level, which gives you a bigger shield. C4 is actually a pretty big deal. You get a lot of energy. You get 15 energy after using your ult, which makes his ER requirements a lot lower. Now, without this, it can often actually be hard to get enough ER to actually get your ult back every rotation, especially in teams that don't generate that much energy, like Wanderer if you're playing without Farazan. Wanderer if you're playing without Farazan C6. If you're looking at teams like the Burgeon teams, where getting more ER is possible, but it's going to come at the cost of EM. If you're running an ER Sands, it means you're not running an EM Sands. And artifacts that give you more ER substats are, more likely not to have EM substats. All this to say, his C4 helps a lot with that, and I'd say that is generally his most impactful constellation. C5 gives you ult damage, which is a little bit more shielding. Overall, it's a decent amount more shielding, but in reality, in practice, you're often getting hit when you don't have all of the shielding from your ult, which means that the skill talent level tends to matter a little bit more for just defensive stuff, but it's still a little bit more shielding. And then C6 gives you some normal charge and plunge attack damage, 15%. It's alright. It's pretty useful for characters like Wanderer. I've talked about Wanderer a lot with Thoma, but he's like the main example of it. He's also a fine defensive utility option for Arlecchino, for Yoimiya, for Hu Tao, for Klee. You're generally going to need to use him for Risley as well. Generally not characters like Lenny that don't really do normal attacks or have the ability to easily weave in normal attacks. But yeah, and he can also be played for Burgeon teams, although maybe a little bit more work to get good damage out of that. Anyways, lastly, we have Sethos on the banner, he's a new character, so I also, just like Lion, have a video on him. You guys can go check that out. But for those of you that just want a short summary, Sethos is an okay carry. His biggest issue is that his overall damage isn't that great, but he does it pretty quickly, which means that he synergizes well with short rotation stuff. But short rotation stuff tends to be a lot harder to play in practice and a lot harder to actually get your theoretical DPS from. You're also an electro carry, which means that Fischl is going to carry your ass, and it's hard to be bad as an electro carry, right? So if you really like Sethos, you can play him and he'll be fine, but don't expect too much out of him. I know there's also some interesting short hold charge attack tech where you sacrifice the damage from his Ascension passive to just do a lot more charge shots and get a lot more aggravate procs. Okay, my Cole decided to not hit them for a while, but Alright, you do something like this. I'm still not entirely sure how good it actually is. You can also play him using his burst, which is generally the best way to use him, is with his burst. So let's get the energy for the burst. And his best combo is just N2. Want to spam that. Overall, he's a fine carry, but he's nothing special. He's very usable if you really like him, but definitely not what I'd recommend overall. His constellations do a decent amount for him. C1 is crit rate on his special charge attack, which doesn't do that much because his best playstyles don't really use it too much. C2 is 30% electro damage, which is pretty good. C3 normal attack talent, which is okay, not the best. C4 gives you 80 EM in AoE, but not in single targets, so it's not the most reliable. But it also gives it to Fischl, which is a pretty big deal. C5 is ult damage. It's okay. And then C6 is also alright. It gives you 1 free shadow piercing shot, which helps a bit because you get to proc your C4 more reliably. I would say that like his biggest constellations are the C2, and then depending on which playstyle you're using, either the C3 or the C5. He's still usable without cons, but the cons do help. But yeah, and then don't go for anything other than Slingshot unless you have the Technadi bow. I don't remember what it's called. Unless you have Hunter's Path, just use Slingshot. But yeah, that does it for the characters. I think this is an average banner. Sethos is an okay character, but 4-star carries that are just okay don't tend to be all that valuable for accounts, because unless you really like them, most people just don't end up playing them. Thoma is situationally quite good, but not the best character. He's useful. I'd say that outside of Risley and Wanderer players, most people aren't gonna have him as a huge priority when it comes to meta. And then Bennett is obviously amazing, but he's not that constellation dependent, and he's a character that is available in the monthly shop rotation, so it's more likely that people have more copies of him already. If you don't have Bennett yet, obviously Bennett is amazing. If you have Bennett C0, his C1 is quite good, and then you also have the C5 and C6 that are also okay, but he doesn't gain as much from constellations as some other characters do. The 5 stars are also, I'd say, relatively average. Well, Alhaitham is above average, but there's no synergy between him and any of the 4 stars on banner, which is kind of unfortunate. And then I think Clorinde is maybe slightly above average, or maybe average, somewhere in that ballpark. But yeah, so honestly, very average banner. It's not horrendous and it's not amazing. It's a chill banner. It's fine. Next up, we have the weapon banner. This is actually a very interesting weapon banner, as it often is when 2 carries of the same weapon type are on banner at the same time. It means that losing your 50-50, quote unquote, it's not really a 50. They're 37.5, 37.5, 15, or 25, sorry. Getting the wrong banner weapon can still be a good weapon for your carry, right? I think that specifically Light of Foliar's Incision on Clorinde in Quick Bloom teams, it's actually very similar to her signature in terms of performance. For Alhaitham, Absolution is a fine stat stick, but it's not the best because he doesn't have a way to get Bond of Life, so he's missing out on a lot of that. But yeah, the 4 stars, we have Stringless, which is a pretty good bow. Generally what you're gonna end up using on Fischl if you don't have a 5-star. And even if you do have a 5-star, if your 5-star is like Scoured Harp, Stringless is very similar to that. It is interesting though that if you are someone who's going for Clorinde, Stringless is pretty good for you because Clorinde's best teams often include Fischl, and Stringless is a very good weapon on her, so that's like a nice thing you're building towards if you do go in this weapon banner. Sacrificial Sword is okay. It's it's the weapon that most people think about when they think about Singto, but often it's not actually that great on him. That being said, it's still a pretty like brain off weapon that works on him, and that makes it you don't have to worry about his ER requirements too much. But outside of that, it's also a very useful weapon on Kazuha to get you more grouping. It's a nice weapon to have available. If you're playing it on Singto, refines are nice. If you're playing it on Kazuha, they don't matter quite as much. It's okay. It's not 5 sword, but still an okay weapon to be on the banner. Lithic Spear is not the best weapon. It needs to be high refined to be competitive most of the time, and it's only competitive in teams where you can proc the passive that requires Leah characters. It's a very situational option. Overall, I'd say that it's one of the worst, maybe the worst polearm you can have on a banner, actually. But even then, it's not that bad. Sacrificial Greatsword is a weapon that used to be worthless. Now is an okay-ish option. It's a decent option on Navia, mainly due to her lack of great free-to-play options. Overall, it's far from a great weapon to have, but it's a decent free-to-play option on Navia, and it's one of the things you can do on like Dory if you're using her, or Sayu if you're using her, but basically the characters that it can be good on outside of Navia are generally characters that don't see that much play in meta teams. And finally, Widsith. Widsith is obviously quite a good 4-star option. Yeah, so it's the only gacha weapon that gives crit, And when you look at a lot of attack scalers, while attack weapons are good on them, a lot of them end up running external attack buffs, which makes crit a better subset to have than attack on your weapon. It also has a very strong passive that front loads a lot of your damage, making it actually competitive with 5-star weapons if you're killing the enemies in only one rotation. Overall, just pretty strong weapon to have, refines fairly well. And so, like, to quickly review the 4-star lineup, we have good bow, okay sword, not the greatest spear, not the greatest claymore, but fine, and then good catalyst. We've seen worse, we've seen better. I'd say this is slightly above average. And then the 5-star lineup, I'd say, is also above average, but it is worth noting that Absolution is not a great stat stick. Like, it's an okay stat stick, but it's not the best. And honestly, same for Lo-Fi. These are weapons that are very good on their signature character and on certain other characters that scale well with the effect. Although right now, for Absolution, that's no one, but it's likely going to be maybe 1 or 2 other characters in the coming patches. This is not actually like sus, like I don't know, but I don't expect them to just do 2 Bond of Life carries and then never do one again. There's probably going to be some more eventually, and so Absolution could see some value there, but it's really, like, they're good signature weapons, but not the best stat sticks. If you are someone who is pulling for the Absolution, for Clorinde, this is a pretty good banner, because getting Lo-Fi isn't even that bad, because Lo-Fi is a competitive option in a lot of her teams, and it's at the very least better than the free-to-play options. And if you are going for Alhaitham, it's a bit worse because Absolution is not quite as good on him, but it's still an okay-ish banner. Very worst case scenario, Absolution is the highest base attack sword in the game, tied with Aquila Favonia and Mistsplitter. And so if you lose your 50-50, your 37.5, 37.5, 25, and end up getting Absolution on your way to light a full in Incision, at least you have a max base attack weapon for Bennett. If you don't have anyone else to use it on, it's still useful, but definitely not the thing you're happiest with. But yeah, so like for me, a perfect weapon banner for Clorinde would be Absolution and Aqua Simulacra, and a perfect weapon banner for Alhaitham would probably be either Lo-Fi and Key, or Lo-Fi and just a good stat stick for him, which Absolution is a fine stat stick, but not the best. Conclusion on it, pretty good weapon banner for Clorinde, above average weapon banner for Alhaitham. But as usual with weapon banners, guaranteeing your weapon of choice is 240 pulls at most. Practically, it's statistically impossible to hit Hard Pity 3 times in a row. It's basically statistically impossible to hit Hard Pity even once, let alone multiple times in a row. But realistically, you're gonna need to have at least 220 wishes saved up if you want to actually guarantee a weapon, which is a lot. That being said, it's also possible that you get it early if you're content with getting the other weapon, right? Like if you're pulling for Absolution for Clorinde and if you get Lo-Fi, you'll just be okay with it and just stop, then that makes it a little bit less cringe. But it is very, very important to keep in mind. Weapon banner, like quote unquote guarantees, are a lot more harsh than character banner guarantees. So keep that in mind if you are considering the weapon banner. Just because it's a weapon banner that is above average doesn't necessarily mean that you should go for it, because the average weapon banner is ass. And it is also worth considering that if you don't have enough wishes to guarantee your weapon, and you actually do want to get it, fate points don't carry over to the next banner. You're gonna have to start all over again on the next weapon banner if you don't end up getting it, right? So it's gonna be difficult to resist the temptation to swipe, and if you're someone who wants to be free to play, then that can be a huge pain in the ass. In any case, don't spend money on this shit game. That's gonna be it for the banner review. Let me know what you think of this format. It's not really a new format anymore, but I do like going more in detail about the characters for the banners. But let me know if that's something you think is getting too repetitive, too annoying. Tell me in the comments down below. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.